Hi, I'm Jeff Ray, your host for Economic Outlook. Thanks for joining us as we explore the trends, the people, and the ideas shaping the region's economy. We're back tonight with an hour-long special presentation about data centers. In recent months, few topics have generated as much discussion in our communities. Supporters point to new investment, tax revenue, and the digital infrastructure needed to power our modern economy. Others are asking important questions about energy use, water resources, land development, and long-term community impact. Tonight, we're taking a closer look at data centers, what they are, why companies are building them in our region, and what it could mean for the future of our communities. That conversation is coming up next. Data centers are the physical backbone of the digital world. Every email sent, every video streamed, every online purchase, and cloud-based service depends on massive facilities that store, process, and move information around the globe. Demand for these facilities has grown rapidly, and the rise of artificial intelligence is accelerating that trend even further. AI systems require enormous computing power, meaning the need for advanced data infrastructure is expanding at an unprecedented pace. As demand for digital service continues to grow, technology companies are expanding their infrastructure, and increasingly, communities like ours here in Michiana are seeing new developments built and more proposed. Supporters say data centers can bring major investment, strengthen infrastructure, and position regions for long-term economic growth. But as proposals emerge, many residents are also asking questions about energy demand, water usage, land development, and how these projects fit into the long-term vision for their communities. In this special one-hour edition of Economic Outlook, we'll explore the data center conversation from multiple perspectives. And joining me to have this discussion are Bill Shalio, the Director of Economic Development from the Department of Infrastructure Planning and Growth with St. Joseph County, Dr. Hong Zhuang, a Professor of Economics and the Chair of Decision Sciences and Economics and Director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research at Indiana University South Bend, Emily Grubert, an Associate Professor of Sustainable Energy Policy in the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame, and Ben Inskeep, Program Director at the Citizens Action Coalition. Welcome, guys. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate you guys all being here with us today on this important topic, one that is really top of minds for a lot of folks, and we're hoping that people get some great perspective from a lot of different views today. So just maybe to start, maybe a quick introduction just so folks understand who all's sitting with us and what your roles are. Bill, let me go your way.
Yeah, so I'm Bill Shalio. I'm the St. Joe County Economic Development Director. Have held that position for almost 11 years now, involved in all of the projects, corner to corner of the county, but specifically the Microsoft project, the AWS project, and the GM EV battery plant project.
Awesome, thank you, Bill.
Hi, I'm Hong, and I'm Professor of Economics from IU South Bend. I'm also the Director of the Business and Economic Research at IU South Bend. So my research focuses on international economics, especially how the investments affects the local communities. And yeah, I've been with IU South Bend for almost 19 years.
Wonderful, appreciate you being here. And a repeat guest, thank you for coming back. You too as well, Bill. Emily, how about just a quick perspective on what you do out at Notre Dame?
Yeah, I'm Emily Grubert. I'm an Associate Professor of Sustainable Energy Policy, and I work mostly on energy systems, especially as we think about climate change.
Great, appreciate that. We'll look forward to the conversation. Ben, an introduction of you and the Citizens Action Coalition.
Thank you. I'm Program Director at Citizens Action Coalition, been there for 4 years. We're a consumer and environmental advocacy organization that does all our work here in Indiana, and we're taking a very lead role in terms of responding to the data center onslaught that Hoosier communities are facing at the grassroots level, in front of our Regulatory Commission, and in front of our General Assembly.
Great, thank you, Ben. Appreciate you all being here. So, Hong, let me come your way a little bit. So, just to talk economy a little bit, and certainly at a high level, we're seeing major investment in data centers around across the U.S. I think the data center industry has promised about $2 trillion of projects in the next several years. Give us a high level of just kind of economy overview and kind of what's going on and that's maybe helping drive this.
Sure. So we're seeing that the investment in data center, I think this year will outpace the investment in office spaces. This is like the first time, which means that we will see less office buildings are built, but more data centers are under the construction. And according to the statistics, in 2025, at least 23 states are building the data centers. And as of 2025, there's over 5,000 data centers are built. This is the trend because of the demand for AI, because of the demand for artificial intelligence, and then the cloud services. Now, the investment is a big part of the U.S. GDP, and if we see the investment going up, of course, the first part is that the production, aggregate production would go up, and production turns into the income, and the income flows to the households that increase their income. And when the income increases, that further supports the household consumption. And you can see that trickles down, and there is the multiplier effects that would help boost the U.S. economic growth. Yeah.
And Bill, so you've had a chance to, as you mentioned, to be involved here locally, especially in the data center conversation. You mentioned AWS and Microsoft. Talk to us a little bit about those projects and your role with them.
Yeah, so our role started from day one, the first day they came into the community. We walked them through the process, what it was going to take to build here, from permitting and zoning and all those kind of things. As we've gone forward, especially with AWS, we've worked with them to craft local agreements on how they would pay for their utilities and how they would pay for other improvements that would need to be done. At about this point, we've done about $90 million in new infrastructure just on the AWS project. Having a similar conversation with Microsoft on the other side of the county, a much different scale project, but again, a lot of utility work that will go into that project, so we're crafting those agreements, and then again, working through from start to finish. So it really is, especially the AWS project, the speed at which they have moved has really demanded a lot of work of the county and all of its partners to get the project from one end to the other.
Great. We're going to take a quick break here in the studio, run out to the field. Jeff Jarnecki, the head of Visit Southland Mishawaka, is joining us. Let me toss to the field, Jeff.
So at least in this instance, in the projects in New Carlisle with AWS, and we'll put the Synergy Cells project in as well, since it's going on concurrently, but specific to AWS, when you have multiple thousands of construction workers out there each and every day, majority of which aren't local. And so what we saw in St. Joseph County in 2025 included more than 141,000 hotel room nights that were generated because of those projects. And so those are people that are coming in, and we're able to see their patterns of what they're doing and where they're going and where they're coming from. But they're coming in on Monday morning. They're staying with us through Thursday night at one of our hotels. And then they're departing on Friday, and then they pick up and do it all over again on the next week. And so those were room nights that didn't otherwise exist within St. Joseph County in the sense of that vertical in particular. Those are room nights that we believe are going to exist for the next few years as construction continues out in New Carlisle. And those are opportunities to welcome people to our community that might not otherwise be here. And so do they come back in the future with their families? Do they come back and maybe reside here in the future? Or are they at our grocery stores and our shops and at our malls and at our restaurants, in addition to being at the hotels? And so the idea that we're able to welcome that number of people on an annual sort of basis that are generating those sorts of room nights through our community because of economic development is just tremendous and almost impossible for us to replace. The average daily rate that we had this past year was $136 per night. Now, University of Notre Dame will cause that number to go up when you talk about 7 home football games and a concert, which are always going to be additive to our economy and to our portfolio within St. Joseph County. But the idea that $141,000 at $136 a night adds up really quickly. For us, it's not so much that we're looking at 25 as that high watermark, which it certainly is. We want it to be our starting point as compared to our finish line, that we think that we can use that, and knowing that that construction is going to continue for the next several years within New Carlisle, that we take that energy, that we take that success, and that we take that momentum and take then, frankly, the proceeds that come from that and invest those dollars wisely, such that when the construction projects are complete and they're fully operational, that we're able to continue to build upon that infrastructure and continue to build upon that hospitality offering within our county, so that we don't just look back at 2025 fondly and remember what happened, but actually use that and turn that into something really meaningful and powerful for St. Joseph County. I think we are entering a new phase economically within St. Joseph County. And the reason behind that is, as we look at what happened around the rest of the state in terms of occupancy, that's why our success was so noteworthy. The rest of the state actually decreased about 1% in terms of occupancy year over year from 24 into 25, whereas we grew by 14%. And so that's undeniable in terms of the economic activity that's taking place, not just within our attractions, our destinations, but largely buoyed and seen as a catalyst because of the construction projects that are taking place in New Carlisle. So, what our businesses are doing, whether it's a restaurateur that perhaps purchased a food truck, and anecdotally, we hear stories of more than 200 pizzas being sold a day out there to the some 4,000 construction workers that are on site. Even if 50% needed lunch, then there's a new opportunity of 2,200 mouths to feed that weren't there last year, that weren't there in 24. And so those opportunities are so prevalent, and so much so we're able to track then through our technology where they're coming from, what they're doing, and then where they're going afterwards. And so they show up on Monday morning, they're on the job site for about 8.1, 8.5 hours. Many of the top referral sites are then to a hotel within South Bend. And so then when they're at that hotel, then we also see that they're going to restaurants and they're going to other amenities. And then they do it all over again on Tuesday and then on Wednesday and Thursday. And then they depart on Friday and then just pick up and do it all over again then next week.
Jeff, thank you. Appreciate that perspective. A lot of different perspectives to get to on data center. Just another one. Ben, let me come your way. You mentioned in your intro that you've had a chance to be involved in not only data center projects here, but kind of around the state. Talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing in the data center space.
Yeah, that's right. We're seeing a lot of data center proposals across the state. We're currently tracking more than 50 AI data center proposals in Indiana. Not all of them are going to be built, but certainly some of them have already started construction, such as the project in New Carlisle. But many communities are also pushing back. We've seen at least 14 communities successfully push back on a data center proposal and stop it from moving forward. And at the same time, we're also seeing a lot of proposals reconsider their concessions to the community, beef up the amount of money they're providing through local property taxes, make additional contributions to nonprofit organizations, respond to community concerns about water usage. So we're also seeing that this active community pushback is leading developers to have to address some of these impacts that their facilities and developments are causing.
Thanks, Ben. Bill, I'm going to come your way, and then you, Emily. Bill, talk just for a second about, as we mentioned with Hong, like data centers are proposing like $2 trillion worth of projects across across the country. Indiana has been mentioned, has become a popular spot. Why Indiana? Why is it they're looking at our state for some of this kind of development?
So obviously a number of reasons, whether it's big land, big power, big water that we have, a lot of those things. The state, though, years ago put in a very favorable tax policy for incentives for both power usage as well as for some of the employment things related to the data centers themselves. So from a tax policy, very favorable conditions. So, and I think for years, the state of Indiana had a very favorable stance towards economic development. We certainly still do, but really was looking at those kind of projects. And I think that's part of the reason why we got ourselves on the radar. And again, we are the crossroads of America. All the fiber runs, just south of the lake, comes right through this area, comes through the middle of the state. So there's just a lot of reasons why we really hit the mark.
Yeah, and obviously they are being proposed in quite a few states, as Hong mentioned, but certainly Indiana feels like it's in the center of a lot of those proposals. Emily, let me come your way a little bit, because your expertise on the energy side of things, and certainly energy is a big piece of the discussion here. They need power, they need water. Give us some energy insight or perspective.
Yeah, this has been a huge topic in the energy community, and especially the electricity modeling and assessment community for a while, because this is really the first major growth that we've seen in electricity demand in quite a while. A couple of decades that the U.S. has really seen basically flat electricity demand. We expect that as the system changes, we're probably going to use electricity for more things like cars and heating and things like this. But right now, the data centers are really the big story. The thing that I think makes people particularly interested in this is that we're seeing really pretty significant costs associated with it, because there's so much speed with the implementation that equipment's getting more expensive. It's hard to find things quickly. So we are seeing some cost impacts and also some environmental impacts that are actually fairly new versus what we've seen over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, and Bill, sorry to come back your way, but since you've been involved in this, so talk about this energy piece a little bit, or maybe build upon this, because you mentioned, I always think like Michigan's a peninsula, so the power has to kind of dip down through here, but as as you've been in these meetings and talking with folks about, kind of the energy demand and such, give us some perspective from the companies as they're looking at this area.
Yeah, certainly, and so both Microsoft, and Amazon came to us through the power company. So that was where the lead came, and they brought them to the market and really kind of worked through the whole process. From a power side, though, where we're positioned, we're right at the far west edge of the PJM power grid. The MISO power grid just is on the other side of the county line. We've got a lot of power coming out of Michigan, so the soon to be 2 nuclear power plants there. A lot of the power comes through the Dumont substation down south of Potato Creek. So just where we are, we have a lot of power that comes through the grid, and so that's part of the sell, so to speak, for St. Joe County, is because of the amount of power that moves through the area. Now again, a lot of that power created up in Michigan goes other places, but it's got to come through us first before it goes to those other places. So we do have a lot of power in the grid. We have the St. Joe Energy Center is making power right now, currently putting that power into the PJM grid. It'll soon go into the MISO power grid based on a recent sale. But again, opportunities for upgrades of the power and upgrades to those kind of things is part of these kind of projects.
Great. Ben, can I come your way, and let's talk from an energy perspective, because I think as data centers have advanced forward and the public is providing input, that the energy use is something I think that has folks concerned. Can you share a little bit of perspective or what you're hearing on the energy side?
Yeah, the energy demands of these facilities is truly mind-boggling. Just one AI data center can use the equivalent amount of electricity as 730,000 Hoosier households, to put that in context. So we're talking about, enormous infrastructure, enormous new power plants that are going to need to be built, and then layering that on top of our current utility regulatory framework, which does not provide a lot of protections for residential customers. And that's part of the reason why we've been seeing major bill increases across time, is because our residential customers often are footing the bill for industrial customer expenses for the grid updates. And so that's one of the big concerns I think a lot of Hoosiers have, is how are data centers going to impact my utility bill? And right now we have a lot of concerns on that front of who's going to be picking up the tab for the enormous amounts of infrastructure spend. So for example, we're seeing Indiana Michigan Power is not currently charging some of their data center customers to connect to the grid, and instead those hundreds of millions of dollars in upgrades are being spread out across other ratepayers. So right now we have a lot of concerns that we need to make sure these data center customers are paying their fair share of costs and aren't burdening Hoosiers with higher bills.
Bill, can I come back your way a little bit? Because certainly what Ben raised about some of these concerns, but recently I&M made some announcements about their investment. Share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I&M is going to go to the IURC to ask for a rate reduction. Again, because of value coming into their company, they're going to have the ability to do some discounts and things like that. I mean, maybe to Ben's point, to a degree, the governmental process is flawed. They're going to file with the IURC this year, but those rates won't go into effect until 2027. So, it takes a while to get through the process a little bit.
So part of, though, you mentioned early the infrastructure upgrades that are happening in New Carlisle include upgrading not only road but water, electric as well. So it feels like there's a little give and take, like sort of making upgrades to the system that the system needs, and then the proposal to reduce some rate?
Yeah, so I think a system like AEP has elements of its network that are 50, 60, 70 years old. And so these data center projects are paying for some of those upgrades, upgrading from, kind of a small network to that next level network that we're going to need when we start having electric cars on more of a regular basis, when we're going to have more of these projects. So these projects are driving infrastructure upgrades that are important. We've seen it just in water alone out in the New Carlisle area. The amount of investment we put into upgrading the water network, very important for not only these projects, but also for the community as a whole.
Great. Emily, can I come back to you real quick just on the energy side? Because obviously data centers have accelerated the discussion on energy, but for a long time I think the U.S. has been trying to figure out energy and alternative energies and some of this. So maybe give a bigger, maybe even outside data centers, like with some challenges, maybe even before data centers came on the stream. But so can we provide the power needed for U.S. industry to expand and data centers as well?
Possibly. It's going to take a lot of work, though. I think one of the things in my work, when I look at what kinds of things we need coming out of the energy system, we would expect potentially in the next 3 decades that we need the system to become somewhere between 2 and 6 times the size that it is now. So the data center piece of this driving, kind of hundreds of gigawatts of load is a big deal. We're potentially talking about thousands of gigawatts over the next several decades. So there need to be a lot of upgrades. I think one of the things that I look at in this regard is if we can't handle the data center load, we're going to have some real trouble handling all these other loads. On the other hand, the data centers are putting so much pressure on equipment, just the pace at which we're doing this, that we are a little bit outside of our regulatory areas at this point.
Yeah. Hung, I'm going to come your way because just real quick, and then we'll go back to the field. A lot of talk about onshoring, bringing manufacturing back a little bit. Is there other activity sort of happening in the U.S. in addition to the data center piece that sort of contributes to this conversation about the need for more energy?
As far as I know, as far as my knowledge knows, is that AI and data center, of course, is driving the future investment, and that's probably the major one. Okay. Yeah.
No, I think that's good, because I think that obviously as we look at industry and such, there's been a lot of talk about onshoring, so other industries, but obviously the data center driving.
Data center now is definitely driving the investment, and I have a quick data that, so if we take a look at the U.S. 2024, the fourth quarter GDP data, that U.S. is sitting around $31.5 trillion, and then based on the announcement, you have a number say $1 trillion, and then what I read was that Amazon, Google, Meta, and Microsoft altogether have announced close to $700 billion of capital expenditure this year. So that is around 12.7% of gross domestic private investment for the U.S., and that accounts for 2.7% of the U.S. GDP. So you think about this magnitude, it's huge. It's huge. Nothing else so far is comparing to it.
Right. Great. We're going to leave the studio here. Ben mentioned that communities are approaching this in different ways. We're going to go out to Mark Allen. Mark is in Stark County and is going to talk a little bit about Stark County's moratorium on data centers.
I'm on the Planning Commission. So the Planning Commission, I'm the Vice President. My name is Mark Allen. We were looking at doing something because we were running into companies that were talking about possibly putting a data center in Stark County. The moratorium is 12 months. What we're doing is we're doing more research. I do know that myself and a couple of other board members I've actually been involved with some of the locations up here in South Bend. I'm an electrician at Memorial, so I interact with some of the contractors that are out at the data center. So I think more than anything, we're going to get our research in. I do know that there are tons of environmental issues that's been discussed and power capacity issues. The data centers use a ton of power. I do know that. I met with the generator company that actually is providing generators to the Amazon facility, and how many generators they have and how much power is needed to run those data centers. So I think that that's a factor into this deciding for the county. People don't want to see their utility rates go up, very minimal amount of jobs. I just don't think that the county, our group, is really behind it, and I think the county as a whole isn't behind it. So I kind of think it's going to be extending the moratorium or no data centers at all, because there's a lot of opposition to the data centers in Stark County. We're not prepared for anything of that extreme. So it doesn't make sense for Stark County. If you're going to do something in Stark County, it's going to be something positive, and this doesn't seem very positive for the community. I mean, our job as board members is to try to improve. So I just don't see that as an improvement. I think the water usage is a big thing. They're scared. I mean, they're scared of the water usage. They're scared of the electrical utilities going up. I mean, environmentally, I think Stark County's always been known as a rural community, and I think we want to keep it like that. If you look at the numbers, there's not a lot of job creation for something that's a small scale data center. I don't see that being a big plus in the community. And then the other question becomes, how many people would qualify for those jobs? Those jobs are tech jobs. Stark County is, like I said, rural community. Not a lot of, I'd say, doctors. You know, I mean, you're talking a different level of education requirement to work at some of these data centers. So you have to have a lot of maybe a electrical engineer or something like that. And, you know, there are some in the community, but I just think it would be harder to find people. And so, you know, you'd gain a couple production jobs. You'd probably get a tax benefit, very minimal. So the bottom line is, how many jobs are available in the position? I don't know how many jobs were created about the Amazon. I can't tell you that, but I just know from what I read, there's not a lot of, when the dust all settles and everything's done, there's not a lot of jobs. It's mostly self-sufficient. I think for a while there, I think that the state was letting solar and data centers and all this other stuff just come in and not have any regulations. And I think now we're seeing more of that tighten down. I don't know how tight they're making it, but I do know for a fact that it's been like, there's been a push down at the State House to look at, that was one of the discussion of having their own power source for data centers because of the demand for power. I don't know about the water source yet, but I do know that a lot of the data centers are getting more efficient, so they're using less water. So I expect the push will be to try to get them to where they don't use a lot of water. And if they provide their own electric, then it may be something to consider. But at this point, it's not going anywhere in Stark County that I see.
Mark, thank you. Appreciate you sharing that perspective. Ben, let me come your way, because we talked earlier about just, this is not for every community, this is not for every, property out there. Mark brought up, some good points. So talk a little bit about just maybe the trend in some communities, maybe some of the more rural ones, on moratoriums and other things related to data centers.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of local communities are now kind of grappling with data center proposals or discussions of them. And so I would say that it makes a lot of sense for communities to consider a moratorium on data centers so they can make sure they have the right regulations in place, make sure they're considering this type of development and the impacts it could have on their community, and deciding whether or not it's the right fit for the various parts of their community. As we've heard, there's tremendous impacts at the local level, things like lots of diesel generators that can be providing backup power but creating lots of local air pollution impacts. We're hearing lots of noise from data centers. If they're sited near residential communities, it can be extremely burdensome to those folks to hear that kind of noise on an ongoing basis. We're looking at potentially some significant water withdrawals, water impacts, not just in the amount of water they're using directly on site, but also the water that the power plants that they're going to need in order to operate are using potentially in other communities. And then there's all sorts of pollution impacts from the power plants to the potential stuff that's in the water that the data centers are putting in to prevent things like corrosion in their pipes. So there's a whole host of issues that local communities are learning about. And the more they learn, I think the less they like about these data centers, especially when you see that they're going to provide very few jobs to local residents, other than short-term construction jobs. Once they're fully operational, they're providing very few jobs, particularly relative to the amount of power they're consuming. And then when you add on top of that the enormous subsidies they're getting, we're talking on the order of billions of dollars for each data center, both in terms of the state the state sales tax exemption and local property tax abatements that can be layered on top of that. These things aren't providing a lot of resources for many communities too. So I think when they're looking at the trade-offs, more and more communities are asking, why should we move forward with these? And I think they're deciding that a moratorium is the right first step.
Ben, let me push back for a second, because you suggested these companies plan to pollute the air. Isn't this a heavy regulated industry? Don't they have to sort of meet pretty strict guidelines? I'm confused that knowingly they'd come in and plan to pollute the environment.
No, the environment is not regulated very heavily in Indiana. We are a state that has very lax regulations, and we have very few enforcement when companies break the law and are not complying with environmental regulations. I think the biggest issue with the pollution impacts would be from the power plants that are going to be serving these data centers. And so while they do have regulation, they are still allowed to emit a lot of pollution that can negatively impact communities. We're talking about a severe public health and environmental impacts from the pollution from the coal plants that are continuing to operate as a result of data centers, the new gas plants that Indiana Michigan Power wants to build and buy in order to serve the data centers, the on-site diesel that's up to 1 million gallons being stored at these facilities and then used in a backup scenario. So I would say Hoosiers are definitely right to be concerned about the environmental impacts. And Senate Enrolled Act 277 that was just passed this past legislative session does a number on completely gutting the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, so further eroding our already weak environmental regulations. So there's a lot of concern here.
Thanks, Ben. Bill, let me come your way. So both Mark mentioned in his remarks, Ben mentioned this job piece. Give us some job perspective.
So earlier this week we got numbers from Amazon, and maybe let me take a sidestep. So from a construction standpoint, we've seen kind of at the high water mark of the construction, about 5,000 construction workers on site. A fair amount of those local tradespeople, from all ages, all sectors, all things like that. A lot of people have been brought into the market. So say 5,000 construction workers. Again, those are temporary jobs, as construction jobs are supposed to be. You start a project, you end a project. But from a permanent job perspective, earlier this week we got numbers from Amazon that of the 7 data shells that they have that are active presently, they've hired over 900 employees. And those are permanent jobs that people that work for Amazon. So those are, if you split those people up over 4 shifts, they estimate it takes anywhere between 15 to 25 people to run a building per shift. So those are anywhere from data splicers and fiber splicers to engineers to electricians to all sorts of different technical abilities. So it isn't that it's just electrical engineers and computer scientists that are running these buildings. It really is a variety of trades and skill sets that have to run these buildings. And again, each building takes a certain number of people to run. So it's a little misnomer that it's just Jim and Tim that run a data center campus and 2 or 3 guys and that everything's done remotely in another company or country. A lot of that work does have to happen on site based on the way these hyperscale projects work.
So maybe just if I could follow up, just a little perspective on this job piece. So 900 seems like a lot. Put it in perspective of sort of largest employers in the area, and then talk for a second just about wages associated with the jobs.
Yeah, so from a wage perspective, to take in the way the AWS project, Amazon Web Service project, was set up, is to be eligible for the enterprise technology exemption. The jobs had to meet 125% of the average wage of St. Joe County. Right now, the average wage in 2026 puts that job at $36 an hour. So, just even a starting pay, the average wage has to be at a minimum of 36, and then you add benefits and other factors into that. And again, it's an average wage, and there are wages that make more, wages that make a little less. But that's a starting point. Again, 125% above our existing average county wage. That number, to keep that incentive, so for the next 35 years, for Amazon to keep the enterprise technology exemption credit, they've got to meet that wage. That wage hopefully will go up every year. So that number at 36 today, maybe 38, maybe 42 in a couple of years. So, we think from a job pay standpoint that's something that's going to help the whole county, and it's going to move that number up over the next several years.
And the 900?
Oh, and the 900. So originally when Amazon came to our market to commit for jobs, it committed to 1,000 employees, 600 that were going to be kind of satellite workers or contract workers, 400 that would be actual Amazon workers. These 900 plus jobs on campus right now are the Amazon jobs. So already with 7 buildings versus 16, they've well exceeded their job goal requirement. And we anticipate when we get the numbers on the contractor jobs, that number is going to be that much higher.
Great. I'm going to come to you and then back to the field. So build on the job piece of this, because I think, sort of as an overarching goal, how do we grow wages, which help families, which help neighborhoods, and all this. Give us some job perspective.
Sure. I have the data from 2025. So based on the first 8 months average data, so for South Bend, Mishawaka, MSA, the average hourly earnings for those private jobs is around $31.6. That's the average. So if $36, well above the average earnings. And then for Elkhart County, that's similar. It's $31.77. And then in 2025, the average total non-farm employment per month in South Bend and Mishawaka MSA, it is 142,000. So if adding 1,000 jobs permanently, so that's close to 0.7% of the job increase. I would say that's very significant. Not to mention that if the additional jobs, of course, like we talked earlier, that right, the income flows to the households, and more households get employed, more income is generated. So their demand for housing, food, education, and has a lot of supporting service. So there will be multiplier effects that would help support and increase the aggregate output and aggregate income in South Bend area. That's
great, thank you. Guys, we're going to take a quick break again here. We're going to go back to the field. George Lefaniotis, my co-host, is back, and he is over at Ivy Tech talking a little bit more about kind of the jobs and training to sort of help prepare people for jobs in the data center industry. George, let me toss it to you.
Thanks, Jeff. And it's nice to be back on the show doing what we love to do. I'm here at downtown South Bend on the campus of Ivy Tech Community College, and I'm joined today by Amber Ruskowski. Amber, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Amber, I'm going to butcher the title, but I believe you are Vice Chancellor, and I'm looking at my notes, so I'm cheating already, but for Ivy Plus Career Link and Community Partnerships.
That's correct.
All right. It's a mouthful because before we went on air, I asked you what your day-to-day was like, and you said it's never the same thing twice. Tell me a little bit about your role here at Ivy Tech Community College.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, appreciate you being here today. So Ivy Plus Career Link is, you can kind of think about it as your traditional career services for our college students, but it really is delivering an awesome customer service experience for also our employer community as well. So you can kind of think of our operations in 3 buckets, if you will. So we have everything related to apprenticeships. So that's our building trades union, and then our incumbent workers upskilling. We do that. And then we have employer consulting services where we have staff who will go out into the field and meet with our employer partners to really understand their current talent needs and what that needs to look like from an upskilling perspective. And then we have our traditional career services pieces that you would find at any college or university. So things like polishing up a student resume, getting them prepared for interviewing, those different types of pieces.
So really, you are the link between a college student and a potential employer.
Absolutely.
That's great. And really, the key that we're talking about today is data centers. They are controversial, I will say, but really at the heart of it, they are just another business looking to take advantage of what we as a community have to offer. And one of those pillars, I think, is our workforce, right?
Absolutely.
The people that we have that are willing, young folks that are willing to get into careers, and the institutions like Ivy Tech that are willing to help them get the skills. Talk a little bit about what that process would look like for a young person looking to build a career and potentially get into working in a data center.
Yeah. Well, I think that looks a couple of different ways. So we're really focusing on starting to build that pipeline for data center careers all the way in the K-12 space. So we're reaching down and we're partnering with our high school communities, partners, and some of the districts to start getting in front of students and talking about what data center careers look like. What types of jobs are available? What does that look like? What does a day-to-day look like? What type of skills do you need? So we're kind of having those conversations with our youth. And then we're hopefully doing and building some dual credit programming where students can actually get into some of those foundational data center technician or mechanical type courses and start to get that experience and that exposure, get some certifications under their belt, go apply at a data center, AWS or a Google or a Microsoft, and get into their career pathway, but then also have upskilling opportunities as well as an incumbent worker.
So it sounds like you really have a lot of thought that's gone into this. What exactly is Ivy Tech and specifically your program doing to jumpstart that talent pipeline or that preparedness of our local workforce for these jobs?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So we've done a couple of different workshops, some shorter term training and some shorter term pieces that really help lay the foundation to get the pipeline going. So back last year, as AWS was really accelerating their construction out at the New Carlisle site, we were doing a couple of workshops. I2PA, which is their pre-apprenticeship workshop, we did two of those cohorts together, and then we also did an I2PW, which is for the educators to actually help, um, you know, get students to understand what data center work is like. And so that's kind of helping bring the educators along in the community so that they can explain what data center jobs actually look like for students.
Well, and maybe for our viewers, what do data center jobs look like? I've been curious about that for a while. I've heard both different sides that sometimes are technical or sometimes are real entry level. What do those jobs look like and how are these students getting training?
Yeah. So I think there's a range that you can consider. So there are very entry level positions, technician related, in the $22 to $28 per hour range. There are mid range roles, and then there are the higher end roles that you would net anywhere between $80,000 and $100,000 per year. So there's really quite a wide range of opportunity whenever it comes to data center employment. And what I'm finding is that AWS, they have really flexible work arrangements and really flexible operations. So you could maybe be, an evening shifter or a daytime shifter, so there's a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of benefits that also come with the positions as well.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. And finally, when you think about the programming, we talk about fiber slicing. You know, that was something you said a little earlier in some of these. They sound technical. I mean, are these kids really getting that type of hands-on experience in their training?
Absolutely. So here at Ivy Tech, all of our training programs are very technical. They're very hands-on and they're real-world application. So yes, we've done fiber optic splicing workshops in the past. I think we've done two of those previously. We're going to be doing some more. We just received some funding, but we're also working with AWS and their contractors as well to identify some of those training and upskilling opportunities, at the trade level. So we're looking at doing some different training related to low, medium voltage, wire termination, cable pulling, um, conduit bending, more of those kind of technical pieces that the students are going to be doing here.
Hands-on. Yeah, yeah. And quickly as we wrap up here, we think about the partnerships you've already built. You've already built a partnership with AWS and they have begun to support your programming. And you look to future partnerships. Ivy Tech really is poised. If someone wanted to learn more about that career path, where would they go?
So the best place is our website. We have a ton of information. Our South Bend campus website. We have very clear information about the two programs that we've developed for data centers. So our first program is Data Center Technician, and then the second program is Data Center Engineering Operations. And it very clearly lays out the pathway, how students can get started in that. Really excited. We actually have a Saturday cohort that we're working to begin March 21st. For the DCEO programming, and Amazon is currently upskilling about 15 of their employees in that program.
That's awesome. Well, Amber, thank you for being with us. Thank you for the brief overview of how Ivy Tech is responding to the need and the new interest here in Indiana and across the region.
Thank you.
Jeff, back to you, where I'm sure you're talking a lot more about data centers and the challenges that they face, but more importantly, the resources that our region provides that makes Indiana and this area a prime spot for these developments.
George, thank you. Good to see you again. Appreciate that. Emily, let me come your way just because I want to make sure we cover a lot of topics before our time gets away from us. Let's talk water for a second because some of your skills and expertise is in the water space. There's a lot of water questions about these. Obviously, I think technology is evolving in terms. Give us some water perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that comes up a lot is people are like, why are these using water? It's a bunch of computers. What's going on? And generally, it's a cooling need. So there's a lot of heat being put off by these servers, and they need to do something to make sure that they don't overheat. So that's a lot of what the water is being used for. I think one of the concerns is that water becomes a really constant need. You can't really turn it off because then you risk this overheating. It's also not something you can really supply via rainfall. And particularly for the clusters that are being built out here, they're in a pretty sensitive ecological area, so sort of around the Kankakee Marsh and in our very neat Continental Divide region. So the water resources in that region are pretty sensitive as well as being pretty important for a lot of the farmers in the area.
Great. And Bill, can I come your way? Because you've been both with the company and with the town even, as you've been talking about water on these projects. Give us the kind of the local perspective here.
Yeah, certainly. So one of the things we did early on when we started this project is really did a lot of assessments on the aquifer, who's using the water, how much water is coming out, so the farmers, the industrial users, what could potential projects require from water use and things like that. So we spent a lot of time doing that. So we sit on an aquifer that the estimation is that it generates about 48 million gallons of water a day. And what we did early on is set a limit of 24 million gallons a day that we would take, or that we could take up to out of the water treatment plants that we have. We have 2 water treatment plants that draw out of the Kankakee aquifer in the New Carlisle area. Both are managed by the town of New Carlisle. You know, at a current system rate, we're probably using about 4 million gallons now. Obviously, when GM comes online, more of Amazon come online, those numbers will increase. But we've set a cap and said beyond this,
For all users.
For all users out of the water treatment plants. Now, obviously, you start pulling out the farmers and some of those others, that number shifts a little bit, but some of that's seasonal. You know, the farmers aren't using irrigation pivots in the middle of winter, and so there's kind of a give and take with some of that. The other thing, too, though, is when we look at water, as Emily mentioned, you know, you're obviously heating, you know, the buildings heat up, you got to cool them. So the evaporative cooling systems that they use really are only used at the heaviest amount, you know, maybe 6, 7, 8 days a year. So when we talk about our water system, we built, we joke, it's kind of like the mall parking lot. You build a mall parking lot for Black Friday and kind of the heaviest days of the year. Our water system is built for that. The average daily use of this water is pretty low in comparison. And then, you know, we talk about technology. If you jump to the other side of the county, the Microsoft project is really only going to use water to the buildings for fire protection and then sinks and toilets. All the water and the cooling systems in that will be brought in, put into the system, pulled out of the system, and then treated elsewhere. So water usage, again, as these buildings become more efficient, the water usage becomes much more efficient with it.
And my guess, yeah, technology is probably evolving really fast. Ben, I want to come your way. We're going to go to the audience real quick, but I'll give you 30 seconds, if you don't mind, Ben, just to add some perspective on the water side before we move on to some audience questions.
Yeah, I would emphasize 2 points. You know, one is the lack of transparency. We're getting, a lot of the data centers aren't telling us how much water they're going to use, so that's a big problem. The second point is just to go back to the power plants. The power plants that these data centers need to operate use an enormous amount of water. For example, the 2,600 megawatt gas plant that NIPSCO is building for Amazon could use more than 20 million gallons per day. So very big impact, not just on site, but also off site.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it. We're going to go. So recently, a meeting about data centers up in Harris Township, we had a chance to grab a couple from the audience and have them ask questions that we're going to talk about here. Let's go to our first question.
My question for the panel would be, is that obviously the process for data centers to be determined in a certain area is very flawed. And I would just ask, why does seemingly one department, the Economic Development Department, have so much power and say on where these projects go, leaving very little voice to the community who has to live by these data centers? How can we involve the community more for these higher up decisions and involve the people that this will actually affect?
Bob, maybe I'll come your way.
Well, as the Economic Development Department, let me answer that question. So our planning staff spends years building comprehensive plans, establishes areas where projects should go, you know, sets terms and conditions through zoning and things like that. So the data center projects happen in areas that are already kind of pre-selected for zoning and you know, have conditions that are favorable to that, whether utilities or land conditions, other things like that. We don't make that decision. The county council ultimately in St. Joe County is the legislative body that makes the decision whether a piece of property is zoned or rezoned. And so there are a lot of steps, a lot of public steps along the way that determine where these projects go.
Great, appreciate that. All right, second audience question.
What other benefits are these companies going to bring to this area? Because, you know, again, we touched on employment. Not a lot of permanent jobs are going to be created. And if they're going to be donating to local schools, that's fantastic. I want to know how much money, though. I want to know exactly what other things they're going to bring to benefit us, because, man, they're asking us to really take a risk by putting these kinds of things in our neighborhoods. And everywhere else, the people that have those next to their houses hate them. And that is what concerns me, is they're going to be, essentially forcing this on us, because we had no say in whether that land was being rezoned for industrial use. People who lived here had absolutely no say. And so now we're in scramble mode trying to figure out what's going on. And so my question would be, what other benefits are going to be coming? Because, if you're building this in our community, we expect a little bit more for the cost that's going to be passed on to us.
Bill, not to put you on the hot seat, but
Yeah, so the way these projects work, so there's not only the tax benefits that come from these projects. Obviously, they're a large investment, so there's an equated large amount of taxes that they pay. Community benefit programs that are set up. So our new Carlisle deal with Amazon is completely different than the Microsoft deal. Microsoft has come into the market and said they're not going to ask for any tax incentives, and so on top of not having any tax incentives, they're paying for utilities. So in the Mishawaka case, or in the Mishawaka East case for Microsoft, we're looking at probably $70 million worth of utility infrastructure that doesn't exist today, that will be built, that can be extended into the Granger area, into other areas. So that's a benefit. Again, money to schools, partnerships with the park systems. Again, other money that government does not have today that can be used to benefit these areas.
Great. And I didn't want to cut anybody else off if you had things to offer to that, Ben or Hong or Emily, anything to add?
I think the one thing that I would kind of highlight is that a lot of the investment that's happening on the energy side is stuff that the data centers are using. And so they're putting a huge amount of pressure on the energy systems and on a lot of our regulatory capacity in ways that aren't necessarily covering everything that they need. So I think that there are some real questions about that, as well as just, what's the societal benefit of devoting this much resource to this particular use as opposed to something else?
I think from the economic perspective is that, or from the higher education perspective, that I love to see more talents, or more high-skilled talents are attracted to Indiana Ord. Indiana is known for its really good higher education system, but as a professor in a higher education, we hate to see that actually when people receive their bachelor's degree, especially in engineering, then they moved out of the South Bend areas because we don't have jobs for that. They moved down to other parts, say in Indianapolis, or move out of the state in order to find the opportunities. So with the data center build, it's great to have those engineering jobs, to have those technical and technician jobs built. So really hope that would bring the revive of the manufacturing sector in South Bend.
Great. Ben, I wanted to make sure I gave you a chance to weigh in. Anything to add on that discussion?
Yeah, I would add that the risk and uncertainty of the data centers and just AI in general, I think is one of the reasons folks are feeling this anxiety about these developments. A lot of economic experts are now thinking that we're in an AI bubble. A lot of these big tech companies are making really unsustainable investments that eventually are going to run out. Even trillionaires can run out of money when you're spending hundreds of billions of dollars every year. So I think folks are very wise to be thinking not just about the next year, but about the next 20 or 30 years to make sure, are we actually fully protected from the risks? Have we actually examined all the impacts? Are the companies being transparent, and are they being good partners in other communities? And if not, maybe they're not the right fit for our community.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Ben. So just a couple minutes left, and so I'm going to just maybe leave it open for a second and offer maybe a couple last thoughts from each of you. Emily, just as this discussion continues, as communities are wrestling with this, as we're trying to figure this out, any last minute advice to communities as they're thinking through some of this?
Yeah, I think from an energy perspective and just from a resource use perspective in general, there's a lot of stuff that we need resources for. We need a lot of energy for a lot of things that provide a huge amount of societal benefit. This is a situation where we're devoting a lot of resources for not super clear benefits, I think, and just the scale of the kinds of investments we're putting into this rather than something else, I think, is worth really investigating.
Hong, 30 seconds or so on the final thoughts?
Yep, we definitely know the AI is the future trend, and I understand that our county would like to get on the train, and I also think having one data center is great, yet with more data center, and in economics we actually emphasize on the sustainable growth. So we really need to have a comprehensive review of the local resources, that how many data centers can we support. I know that we already have 2, and can we support more? And then with the one that currently have, then what are the mitigation strategies that would make the resources uses more efficient and benefit and address the environmental issues that local residents raised?
Great. Ben, I got about 30 seconds.
One final thought for me is just, this technology, artificial intelligence, the folks that are building these models and owning them are telling us that it's going to be used to actually end jobs, to reduce jobs, kill jobs. So I want folks to think about, even if these AI data centers are going to create a couple hundred jobs in my community, is it going to be taking away thousands of jobs from communities across the United States?
Great. Thanks, Ben. And Bill, final 30 seconds or so.
Yeah, I think this is a great discussion. I think these kind of discussions need to continue to happen. I mean, I think there's great opportunities with the amount of investment to look at power and energy and how we deal with that. I would also say, though, that along the way, we haven't just stumbled into this. We haven't done this by accident. We've been very intentional, whether it's studying water, studying utility systems, studying things like that. So we're trying to put these in the right place, in the right areas, and trying to make the right decisions for the long-term and short-term growth of the communities.
Thank you really to all four of you. We had hoped to bring some different perspective and give our audience something to think about, and we appreciate you all offering your perspectives today. That wraps up this special edition of Economic Outlook. Data centers represent one of the most significant and complex economic development conversations happening in our region today. We want to thank all of our guests for sharing their insights and perspectives and helping explore the opportunities, concerns, and questions surrounding this rapidly growing industry. Thanks for watching on PBS Michiana WNIT. You can find all of our past episodes at WNIT.org, on YouTube, and most major podcast platforms. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. I'm Jeff Ray. I'll see you next time.
This WNIT local production has been made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.